Hi, welcome to Integration, where we explore the arts of moving forward, not just sustaining, but transforming. The great ones among us don't see setbacks, only the landscape of possibility before them. My guests have learned to navigate what is, which is what inspires me, to find ways to keep going and leave the world better than they found it. When the storm comes, they don't just endure, they lean into it. I hope you enjoy my guest today. Welcome, Aida. It's lovely to see you, and I'm really excited, looking forward to talking to you about this, because reading back on your history, I've just been amazed by what you've achieved, what you've sacrificed, what you've done, and particularly at such a big level. And so just for my listeners who may not know who you are, I would like to get you to go in a little bit into your background, including obviously what Mango Bay is, for people that don't know, in the Forestry area, and maybe how big it is, what sort of impact it has in terms of Indonesia's, GDP, and just to give a bit of a background as to why what you did and what you achieved was so significant.
Right. So I'm a forester. So I studied forestry. I studied wood technology, and my life has been. I spent most of my career in a corporate companies. I spent probably 20 years in corporate life, and my last position in the corporation was in 2019, where I was the managing director of sustainability of one of the largest forestry pulp and paper companies worldwide. After I resigned and left the company in 2019, I joined several not-for-profit organizations because I would like to contribute my expertise and my skills to not-for-profit. The one that I'm very active right now is helping smallholders in Indonesia to be able to adopt and implement responsible practices, including zero deforestation practices. And also being requested to join the Mango Bay, which is the largest environmental platform based in USA. I'm also joined the Bioeconomy Forum for promoting sustainable bioeconomy based in Finland, in Europe, and several other not-for-profit organizations as well.
So that's really fascinating, Aida. And what I really enjoyed in reading back about that history of yours is that as you went into that as a forester, like you had this amazing background with your father and actually having, as he was a big forester, and then when you after he finished his studies and did all the rest of it, you then got to actually spend a lot of time in forest from a very young age, which is where you developed that. So maybe for a lot of us that aren't foresters, give us just a little bit of a background in that experience as a young person, what you learned from your father in terms of seeing the difference between a plantation and a forest, not only in the way the trees interact with each other, but also the way the biodiversity interacts with the trees when it's those different forms of tree.
Yeah. So my father is my hero. He was a professor in forest management in Indonesia, probably the youngest professor in Indonesia. So you can imagine I was growing up as the daughter of a forester, and my interest grew when I was like probably 10, 11, where I was asked. Well, I wasn't really asked, but I wanted to help my dad. I saw my dad drawing some maps. Back then, computer mapping with computer wasn't that advanced yet. So he was drawing something on this big table, and I asked him, "What are you doing, Dad?" It's like, "Oh, I'm drawing this map. It's a land use planning map of Borneo, the island of Borneo." And can I have a look? And then so I saw him basically identifying which forest that needs to be protected and which area can be developed into plantation, and what is the condition of the forest, condition of the land. And I was very interested, and I asked him, "Can I help?" And sure, use the dark green for the natural forest that need to be protected, and use the yellow one for area to be developed. There was some numbers in it.
Can I ask, in that moment when he's doing that, did he actually have a way of doing that from a mapping point of view, or had he been into those forests to know which one could be different delineations?
He was in charge of the project for that particular area. It's a small island of Borneo, so he was the project director, I guess. And so he came back from the forest and he basically verified the map from the computer, from the satellite, with the real condition on the ground. Therefore, then he could come up with the real map that reflects the real condition on the ground.
And what were the sort of things that made him decide this could be a plantation and this needs to be protected? What were the sort of key indicators for him to determine that?
The condition of the actual condition on the ground. So when it's a natural forest, then there are indicators that can be used back then. I'm talking about the 80s now, yeah. There were indicators that could be used in the 80s that basically clearly said that this area need to be protected. For example, the area is very steep and it's got a lot of native species of tree species that is important for maintaining biodiversity, important for maintaining the landscape. So there were a lot of indicators already back then in the mid 80s that my father used. So based on that and then verification on the ground, then he could come up with the map. The one that could be developed into plantation or for other uses usually is in the consultation with the local community, and also probably it was what we call it conservation values were very low. So then when there are area with very low conservation values, usually that could be developed into other uses such as plantation.
So what gives you an indication that it's, let's say you're out there and you're deeming this bit has to stay and this bit can go? Is it because of particular species of trees, particular species of animals? I mean, what are the conditions that make that decision?
Okay, so let's fast forward it to this or 2014, for example. But because the story that I used before is what I was helping my dad, that was in the mid 80s, where indicators were quite limited. So let's fast forward to 2014, where I was very much involved in the development of toolkit to define which forest area need to be protected using the latest best practice and the latest science available in 2013, 2014. To answer your question, what indicators is that we're using indicators that is shown by a vegetation of a land cover where this vegetation have the ability to rehabilitate itself to return to its natural condition.
Doesn't need help. It can do it on its own.
It needs help. Nowadays, it always needs help. Why? Because the human interference is always needed nowadays in anywhere, Australia, Indonesia, Africa, because at least the human intervention is needed for creating the boundary of where the area needs to be protected. So it's always human interference needed right now. You cannot just leave it on its own, without any sign saying that it's protected, without any sign. So it cannot be done on its own right now. So
on that point, because I think a lot of people don't understand this sort of stuff that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Particularly with all the wildfire issues occurring everywhere. And my background's basically agriculture, so I know almost nothing about forestry as well. And I know a lot of people basically have a kind of lock it up and leave it attitude. And I've always said, no, but we have to, well, my viewpoint because of agriculture is that we need to have animals moving through the system because the system is actually maintained by those animals. They do breaking things down and they add moisture and they add food and they an empty forest is not a good forest. So I can see it from that sort of logical point of view, but maybe from your more experienced point of view, you could talk about why these, not just putting a boundary around it, but what active measurements are needed by foresters and why that's so vital to being supported, whether by Indigenous people or, foresters doing it themselves.
Yeah, so every forest or every area is different. Australia, like Victoria, New South Wales, Northern Territory are different. Indonesia, Sumatra, Kalimantan, they are different. So what the similarities are, we need to identify what conservation values are represented by this particular area. I give you an example. Central Sumatra, for example. The high conservation values in Central Sumatra would be Sumatran elephant, Sumatran tigers, the bear, some birds. So those are the high conservation values. So in order for that ecosystem to survive, we need that kind of biodiversity where those high conservation values actually not just be maintained, but actually can be enhanced. Without those high conservation values, then the ecosystem is not really healthy ecosystem. Do you understand?
I do, yeah.
And in Victoria, for example, or in New South Wales, for example, we need the koalas, we need the lizards, we need the snakes to establish that as a healthy ecosystem. So those indicators called high conservation values. So we need to identify what are the high conservation values, and we have to maintain and enhance that conservation values in order to maintain the healthy ecosystem. Because without healthy, this is something that a lot of people forgotten. Without healthy ecosystem, nothing else will work, including development. Because the government now is promoting development, jobs. But without a healthy ecosystem, without the biodiversity, all those development will collapse.
So what are the sort of things, like you, in one of your things that I read, you said the cost of conservation, you said in restoring forests is between $500 and $5,000 per hectare. But what are some of the things that people do for that money so that people get an idea of it? Because obviously if a fire burns through naturally and all the animals are killed and everything goes back, it still regreens itself and comes back, and I don't know where the animals go, but somehow they come back into the system. But we're now so intrinsically impacting the environment. What is it that you as a forester would see is that what that money is allocated to really boost that regeneration and make that a less fire-prone forest, for instance?
I collected the data for that number based on tropical forests, so not really Northern Hemisphere or Australian forest. So that 500 to 5,000 is based on what is required to protect the tropical forest, for example. So that's where the numbers coming from. And how I came up with those range is basically, again, when you want to protect certain area or certain forest, you need to understand what conservation values that you are protecting. Protecting tiger would be a lot would cost a lot different from protecting koalas or lizards, for example. And then the condition of the forest itself, is it a deep pit, or is it like different type of soil? So that also requires different cost. And number 3 is basically the level of threats, which is very important in defining the cost for restoration. What kind of a level of threats are you dealing with? Is the area being threatened by fire? Is the area being threatened by development, by human development, construction and stuff like that? So the level of threats determine the level of cost required by this particular area to be restored or to be protected. What's the money for? Can be as simple as forest guards, like establishing boundary, establishing signs, can be as simple as that, or hiring a forest guard to manage the area, to protect the area, or can be as complicated as very high-level interventions such as real planting on the ground to restore denuded land. Can be as complicated as restoring the hydrological system, which can be quite expensive. So depending on which area, but those are the examples of what the money is for. In developing countries, in third world countries, it can be complicated by the condition of the community as well, as in providing the lost opportunity in the effort to conserve the forest.
You've just got so much experience in so many different areas of it, and there's lots of questions that pop into my head as you talk along, and I keep going. I want to try to keep it coming back. So I'm going to ask you, let's say you've spoken about the Sumatran tiger a couple of times. So I would imagine the tiger is something that you're a little bit passionate about.
No.
And you'd like to see the tiger preserved. Now, obviously, a tiger sounds like a wonderful thing, but if you're someone living on the border of a forest and you've got small children and vulnerable animals that you're farming, they're probably not going to be quite so open to a tiger being nearby. So what would be some of the measures that you'd put in place to sort of see those boundaries of people and animals are kept at a healthy distance from each other?
Well, with the current explosion of populations, I mean, we cannot not install some kind of fence. Can be a river, but tiger can swim. So some kind of a fence to fence the areas. But based on my own experience, I work as a managing director of sustainability for this large company, right? And this large company manage more than 1 million hectares of conservation areas, for example. And then we made the announcement that we're going to stop deforestation in 2013. We stopped deforestation of natural forests. Just by that, switching off the excavator and the bulldozer who used to convert natural forest into plantation, just by that simple decision, tiger-human conflicts dropped to zero.
Obviously, that's very hard to get a company to actually do that. That's their bread and butter, those trees they're cutting down. So how do you actually facilitate that? I mean, that's kind of the really extraordinary part of your work, is how have you come up with financial and business models to keep that business still going and yet make that critical decision to stop doing what everybody wants them to do, which is stop cutting down the trees?
Oh, well, you said it is bread and butter, but it's bread and butter for 2 days only, for short term only. And something that us, the sustainability, some people call sustainability expert job, is to actually make other stakeholders see what is required long term, not just short term. And also, it should not be your decision. It should be the decision of everyone, including internal and external stakeholders. Using the example of the company that I used to work for, a lot of input actually came from external stakeholders, such as the NGOs. I worked very closely with Greenpeace back then. So they provided a lot of information of what needs to be done to tackle the issue, the deforestation issue. So engagement and collaboration with external parties is very, very important in achieving something like this. How to convince shareholders and companies? Well, the bottom line number. So you need to be able to show the short-term, medium, and long-term benefit, the financial benefit to the companies if you go adopt certain measures such as zero deforestation.
Okay, so I'm going to come up with something, because even for me, I go, well, if my business is cutting down trees and I make the wood from the trees and you make the decision to not cut down the trees, what on the earth did you tell them to give them another financial option than cutting down the trees? You're in a pulp mill. That's exactly what they did for an entire living. Their whole business model is that. So how did you come up with a solution to that?
Well, the solution is you can continue cutting down trees as long as 100% renewable. So what kind of trees you cut is the question. So back then in 2015, cutting natural forest trees in Australia, we also refer it as native trees, is not renewable, is not sustainable. So stop cutting natural forest trees.
So basically turning the forest focus in where they were getting basically free trees that were already grown into plantation-only trees.
Yeah,
so
plantation.
So basically putting all the focus onto plantation trees. Was there enough viability out of that to replace one for the other, so they didn't? How did you put the business model into that so that they would see that was a financially viable option moving forward to only do plantation trees?
Well, we need to make sure that commercially planted plantation have to be viable, we have to have enough plantation. And secondly, we have to have a technology embedded in the operation to make sure that we can increase the annual increment of the tree growth. So, for example, from 20 ton per hectare per year, we have to have enough technology to be able to increase it to 30 ton per hectare per year, for example. Number 3, we have to have access to global market for pulpwood or other type of trees. Yeah, so those 3 are the top 3 requirement for you to adopt deforestation free. I think it's been kind of adopted by Victoria, for example, already adopted it. And also Western Australia already adopted it. That's based on calculation that those 3 are enough, is already in place.
So when you say making it viable, making them grow more, is that by putting more inputs into the tree so they grow faster?
With technology, there's not necessarily input, but I forgot the name. Not GMO, but is basically, I forgot the name of this. So basically, you do certain research and marrying the trees with each other to come up with a tree with a high growth. So
crossbreeding species.
Crossbreeding. No, this is like some
hybridization.
Yes. Some there's like, what is it? Especially when
did carbon credits make an impact in that as well? Did you manage to marry a carbon credit product in there to try and make up the balance at all financially? I'm always surprised that nobody measures the soil, and a tree, no matter what it is pumping carbon into the soil quite deep. And I'm always surprised that, I mean, sure, if you cut the tree down, you lose all the carbon in the tree, but drawn all that carbon through the tree to make the tree, but it's also taken it into the soil through the mycorrhizal fungi and that interaction in the soil. But they don't seem to focus on measuring the soil. Is there a reason for that?
Who is not focusing on measuring the soil?
People doing carbon projects in forests. I'm curious about that.
Yeah.
Surely that's been discussed. Can't be just me. You must have thought about it.
Yeah. In Australia, it's not yet focused on, but
Indonesia?
A lot of focus has been focusing elsewhere. It's part of the reason why I kind of disagree with this very silo thinking of the Australian carbon market, because they only think about planting, and not really focusing on the soil, like you said, and also not focusing on the carbon that can be generated from native forest or natural forest trees. So Australia is a little bit behind compared to the tropical carbon science in the tropics. So in the tropics, it has been measured. Like I mentioned before, I mentioned peatland. So peatland in the tropics, they have sometimes the carbon inside the peatland is 100 times more than the carbon on the tree itself, maybe the 1,000 times more. So it has to be included, such as with the REDD plus system, the reduction of emission from deforestation and degradation. That's the carbon is included in there. Not yet Australia. This is why I think people like you and I need to not to force, but push the...
I do understand, Ada.
Australian government.
Sometimes a lot of it is just education. Like, I feel that the more I look at science people, the more I see they operate in so many silos. They haven't got the big picture. And so one of the reasons I want to talk to you is because I know, although you're currently based in Sydney, you've been based for many years in Indonesia. And so you have a tropical mindset from that, where you've had all that experience. But as you say, it doesn't really matter where you are on the planet. All planets have different forests.
Yeah.
Pertinent to their conditions. They're all still doing something, and that it's about looking at the value of that. And I don't focus on trees that much because I'm really just trying to push agriculture, because the carbon market has only been focused on trees. And I know they have that if you're doing a tree above the ground, you can't do the soil under it. But I actually know that you can do the soil under a tree under the Australian Carbon Credit Unit. It's just that you have to elect whether you're doing the soil or the tree, not both.
Oh.
So it's
the two.
Because you might cut the tree down. So then it's not sequestered. So remember, we're talking about sequester means to pull away, to put it away somewhere, like a squirrel puts a nut away for winter. He doesn't eat it right then, he moves it away. So a fire burns through a forest and people go, well, then you've lost all your carbon, so that's all a sham. And I say no, because even if the fire has burnt a forest down, it's already pumped all that carbon into the soil and it's still there. It might not be there in the top 30 or 40 centimetres because of the heat, but it will be buried very deep. Some of those trees, I don't know, depends on the tree type, but some of those trees have really, really deep roots and have taken carbon down many, many metres more than grasses can do. I focus on grasses because they're fast regenerating and you can get carbon keep being taken deeper and deeper and deeper. Like in America with the bison, that was up to 7 or 12 metres into the ground, there's carbon. And so I keep saying this carbon discussion is just too superficial. We have to look at what are the plants that take the carbon down into the soil. And my company's Earth, so it's all about the soil. So that's why I ask you, because I don't know anything about the forestry. I do know there's this misnomer about you can't do the soil. You can do the soil. It's just that everybody likes to do the trees because you can measure them from the satellites. And I'm saying, well, actually, it's worth you doing a soil core, because once it's in there, it stays. You know, at a certain depth, it's staying. You'll lose it in the top bit, which is called liable carbon, which is cycling in and out of the soil.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But that deep stuff is really, really what we're trying to get happening. And I think there's a lot of discussion going on. The carbon market's being destroyed by Trump's climate denial policies, et cetera, But people like you and I know that there's a lot more going on that's outside of that rhetoric. And people are well and truly embedded in this. The finance is moving in it. There's a lot of things that are already like a Titanic going towards something. It's still already well and truly established, no matter what Trump thinks who's in for 4 years.
Yeah.
So my viewpoint is I kind of look at that as noise going on because it's been 20 or more years developing it. So I'm much more interested in how are you moving forward? How are you taking those hit and you keep going? So because we've discussed a number of things, a lot of the things I'm sort of doing it just to really give that background of your experience for people like myself that don't know anything about trees. And also then to say, well, what is the next step? Where are we moving forward with this? And so, that's kind of why I've been sort of gearing around all this. Where is your main focus? Do you look at the apex species as the main thing to look at in the biodiversity thing for the for the whole health of the forest? What are the sort of measures that you're looking at? Where does the money need to be deployed? Where can we put the focus to make all those things work? So I know you've moved out of the pulp mill, which for me was into the mouth of the lion, and you did an extraordinary thing turning that company around to a renewable company over 10 years, which I think I missed in pointing that critical point out. But now I know you've been working with small farmers on the ground particularly the Indigenous spaces in a not-for-profit thing. And so I thought maybe we'd just turn a little bit and start talking about what did you do when you learned that. And I want to also preface that, but there was a line in one of your articles where you spoke about Mandela talking about you can talk to the head, but once you talk to the heart, you really get someone to take it on board. And I can see that interaction with people, those stakeholders on the ground really got to your heart. And I feel that's probably why you moved, but please speak on that. And then what have you managed to achieve in doing that, in moving that discussion ahead?
I have a very deep emotional connection with smallholder farmers, especially the local and indigenous smallholder farmers in Indonesia. Because when I was managing director of this large company, I saw the men, and it just really broke my heart. That sometimes, just imagine this. Maybe some Australians cannot imagine that, but in Indonesia, companies are given licenses to operate and to develop massive land, per license can be up to 100,000 hectares. And sometimes in that land, in that 100,000 hectares, there's many, many little villages. So hundreds and thousands of indigenous.
For people listening, do you have some sort of idea about 100,000 hectares, what that is as a space?
Oh my God.
Is it something like the size of Tasmania? I don't know what 100,000 hectares is.
Okay, I have to Google it. I don't know.
Oh, maybe right. I'll look it up and I'll put it in later. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I speak in hectares.
No. I speak in hectares too, but I know this goes out to people in other countries that don't have that idea.
That's true. But in Indonesia, going back to Indonesia, the license issued for 100,000 hectares, for example, and then there's indigenous communities or local farmers living in that land. The companies can just operate on it because they have the license.
They just wipe them out.
They not wipe them out, but they can just operate in the land without the free and prior informed consent from the local communities.
Because they don't own the land?
The local communities, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Because
they can take their trees even if they own the land. Come onto their land and take it.
So sometimes, with the local indigenous community in Indonesia, sometimes they operate on land based on their ancestors. So sometimes because of their ancestors, they don't have the legal license to claim that it's their land. And there's a community to actually can show a legal license that they own the land. For the community that can show the legal license, of course, the company have to respect that. But for the communities who cannot own a legal license because their ancestors been there for 200 years, the companies can do whatever on that land. So that's the condition. So not only you might lose your land, not only for this community, for the smallholders, you might lose your land, but also when you operate land, you cannot separate that particular piece of land from the landscape, because the environmental services of the landscape actually support your piece of land. I give you an example. If you own 10 hectares of land in the middle of a landscape, and the landscape used to be swamp or peatland or natural forest, and then the natural forest around it being destroyed and replaced by some kind of plantation, the environmental service provided by the landscape to the 10 hectares or 5 hectares of land will disappear. So that's something that never been thought by this corporation or some governments.
They don't realize the water goes down from the trees and it feeds it with nutrients, and they don't have that logic. I mean, it is very logical, but
yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. So not only they lose their land, but they also lose their environmental services from the land, from the landscape, from the river. They lose it. So where do they go? Nowhere, right? So I've been really touched by those communities ever since I was in a corporation, and then that's why I vowed when I resigned, I vowed that I would contribute some of my time to support these smallholder farmers. That's where the emotional connection is coming about. So the first things that I wanted to do is actually introducing what responsible best practices are out there that will be beneficial for the smallholder farmers. The no deforestation is a very easy example, because the smallholder farmers want to be able to sell their produce to the market, including international market. And right now, international market basically don't want to buy any produce linked to deforestation. So I have to introduce this concept to them, and how can they surf by adopting these best practices. Where do they get the money from? So if they cannot actually continue with deforestation, for example, they need to protect the forest, for example. Protecting forests need money. So where the smallholder farmers who can barely survive can have extra money to protect the forest if they can barely survive. Some farmers in Indonesia earn about between 100 to maximum $1,000 a month. That $1,000 is very rare. Most of them just earn $100 a month, okay, with nothing else on top of it, no subsidy from the government or anything like that. How can they survive? They cannot even survive to support their own livelihood, let alone supporting the protection of conservation area. So what I've been trying to do to help these smallholders is basically try to connect them with the market, with their off-takers, and also the indirect market in Europe, for example, or in Australia, to get support from their market to address the local issues such as forest protection, for example. I give you a simple example.
Yeah. Is it also food security? Is that also a big focus in that area? Is that of more interest to the government, the food security aspect?
Yes, but the government right now is focusing on large estate of food security aspect. So the current government now under President Prabowo is very interested in securing or developing large food estate level, not community level. What I'm trying to help is to help them on the local community level. Where was I? So
an example. Sorry, I'm interrupting you.
Yeah. So one example is, for example, if I talk to big companies, let's say if I talk to somebody like Woolworths, for example, and then Woolworths gets some of their products, cocoa or palm oil products, whatever, from Indonesia, and then ideally a company like Woolworths will allocate some of their CSR money to help the source of the material they're getting the material from. And that, for example, if they want to focus on palm oil, for example, that can be found in anything, in chocolate, in everything. If they want to help the farmers of palm oil, they can actually channel some of their corporate social responsibility funding into the palm oil farmers, supplying to them to conserve their forests. So that's what I've been trying to do, try to connect the farmers with the consumers so the consumers can do something more to protect the biodiversity and the forest of the source of that particular material.
How are you going with that? What is the sort of...
Very tough.
Very tough? Yeah.
Very tough, yeah.
So is that harder than what you did in the corporate thing within the pulp mill?
Absolutely, because in the corporate mill, I was a managing director. I give instruction, they follow.
Right.
Right now, I have nothing.
How do you see is the way to change that now as you're doing it basically outside of that? NGOs don't have nearly the same power. But I hear you said you worked with the NGOs to achieve what you did within the corporate structure. So now you are an NGO. Has that given you the ability to try and, your way back into changing the mindset of the corporate structure?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, like first, I helped the organization called High Carbon Stock Approach to come up with the only methodology to end deforestation in the tropics, for example. I managed to help the smallholder organization, the largest smallholder organization in Indonesia, to commit to no deforestation. And that, of course, push to their off-takers, the buyers, the consumers. And thankfully, people still listen to me. They do.
So tell me, in a lot of the stories that I read through the articles, and I will put them in the show notes because you've done some amazing things. You speak about tremendous obstacles, which is just like what you're facing now. And as the theme of my podcast is really about inspiring people that there's a lot of people like yourself and myself that have been 20, 30, 40 years really advocating for nature on some level and are getting burnt out by it. It's so hard for them because it's always negative. And you spoke about some really heavy things that you'd gone through, having to just go straight back into it a day after your husband's funeral, many things that you've had to deal with. And now you're dealing with the emotion of these small farmers that have no voice, and you're trying to help get funding into that area to make a change. How do you give yourself the energy to keep going when you come up against those very emotional obstacles? Because I can see you're passionate about it.
Break your target into pieces. Don't do black and white. Don't do this or nothing at all. You're going to break yourself if you think like that. Break your target into smaller pieces, smaller milestones.
Things you can achieve.
So what is it you can achieve? If you achieve small, don't get disappointed. If that you achieve small, it's okay. Small is the start for the bigger, something bigger. That's one thing. And also, don't be too radical. What I mean by that is there are things that can be solved pragmatically. Negotiation is always a must. You cannot push something always. You can't win everything. You win some, you lose some. And it's okay to lose some. So that's how I always try to... Could you reframe that into that Mandela quote you're saying by having, you have the corporate mindset, so you're fully aware of the heart of the corporate mindset, and now you're having the smallholders mindset, and so you're bridging between those two minds and finding the language that communicates to both of them on a topic, so you're finding where is the little bit of the bridge and building layer upon layer in that way. Is that kind of the way you're addressing it? You said the great point over there that I wanted to say. You said the language. Sometimes the language is number one. Just because you want something, for example, you want to end deforestation, doesn't mean that you have to use that language. Depends on who do you want to convince. So language is number one in the engagement strategy. Sometimes people forget that. Sometimes they yell, I want to stop. And then you use the same language for corporate, they will not buy you. You have to use corporate language. You have to use government language. You have to use NGO language, farmer language. So you have to be able to master on how to communicate with different audience to get the buy-in. Sometimes people forget that.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it's kind of touches a little bit about a lot of the thing that I was sort of motivating me to do this podcast in total is particularly now, like everybody's going anti-Trump, Elon Musk, they're just all about billions of dollars and all this sort of thing. And, they're wiping out all this and everyone's going to suffer. It's like the entire focus is on the negatives rather than on the positives. And a bit like you, I know that nobody actually wants to have a planet that's barren and denuded and no future for anybody in it. And so finding the language that moves within that, like I would say, I have no idea what Trump will do, but I would say that he'll probably, because the market, that's one of the reasons I was sort of asking you a little bit about the market moving towards something. It's such a Titanic of energy towards sustainability now that even if he decides to come out of it, and yes, Bezos is stopping and, I've heard all these things that are happening. The money's coming out, but there's trillions and trillions of dollars already heavily invested in infrastructure and methodologies that we've spent 20 years building. Do you feel that they're now at a point of maturity where a lot of that stuff will continue independent of government intervention just because it makes good financial sense, it makes good longevity sense, it makes lots of reasons why it makes good sense, because arguments like you've said have actually impinged and educated and communicated why this is actually better in the long run for those businesses and for the smallholder? Do you feel that's actually at that point now? What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. Look at the companies that I resigned from. They continue with their zero deforestation. They continue with their peatland best practice to maintaining water level. They didn't stop just because I left, because they saw that it's happening. No more fire for how many years? No more fire destroying their asset for how many years? It's partly because of no deforestation and also implementation of best practice. Donald Trump happened before. He left Paris Agreement before. Did it stop us? No. You know what I mean? So it happened before. We saw what happened, and we saw what we end up with. More commitment. There's one thing might be okay. This is probably a little bit controversial.
Go for it. I love controversial.
There is something that I kind of agree a little bit with what Donald Trump said. Paris Agreement. How long we've been talking about Paris Agreement? Since Paris Agreement was 2016, was it? Before that,
it's even earlier. It's a long time. I know it's well over 20 years.
Yeah, and then Kyoto Protocol, and then everything else, right? Have we actually reduced emission? Have we actually done something? Maybe a little bit, but definitely not enough. So maybe we need something else on top of Paris Agreement to make things quicker, to make things better. I don't know. The way he restructured USAID, maybe USAID needs to be restructured. I mean, the way he did, I don't agree with what he did. Yeah. But maybe some kind of restructuring need to be done on these donor funding organizations. Maybe. So
too much complacency, not enough thinking outside the box. Yes. I agree totally.
So don't focus on the negative. Focus on the what could be and positively. Maybe we need something else that is competing with Paris Agreement to make things faster.
Yeah.
Never know.
In that point that you made about has the carbon really changed? And then people immediately jump in on, it's all a hoax and it's this and that, the other. My viewpoint is really, it's just that the carbon market is the only thing that I've seen come on which will actually fund a farmer to nurture land in front of him for the reward of carbon. And it doesn't really matter if you talk carbon, water, or biodiversity, or food security. They're actually all one thing. It's just that carbon is the simplest element that you can measure because biodiversity is very site-specific, very minute to areas and very, very complex to measure. Right. And I find it annoying when everybody keeps going on about the fur fee because it's really just because nobody wants to pay for nature. And it's just a digression. So when anybody talks about it, I go, they're really pro-fossil fuels. So that's fine. You can be pro-fossil fuels as long as you actually help the farmer get, carbon into that earth so that we have water being retained and food and nutrients. Biodiversity can manifest. If you don't have that carbon, the rest of it all goes by the way anyway. So those things are kind of critical. And I love that you talk about breaking outside the box because I say to people, go for it, pull the carbon out of the ground, go for it. Keep taking the coal out. I don't care, keep doing that. But as long as you're paying for doing that, to the farmer that's putting it back in multiple fold, because the plants really are what is the cure to all of it in whatever form. And so I'm very pro. And what inspired me the most about you is how much you think outside the box and addressing a really difficult problem with what I would have thought is stonewalled. Absolutely, this is the way we're doing it. We're not changing. And you've gone, right, how can I think around that? Which I love your thinking, Ada, and all this. That's why I was really looking forward to talking to you.
Yeah, thank you. It's basically a hybrid thinking between corporate world and a not-for-profit that forced me to think that way, because like in the corporate world, you are given a budget. That's it. Given you work on this and then create profit. So there's so many limitations. So you are forced to be able to think out of the box, to think, well, I want to achieve that, but maybe I should go that way, to the left and to the right instead of going straight. So I've been forced to be able to think that way, but I think that's the only way to go forward, There's another thing that I think is controversial.
Do you think that the ESG investing and green bonds might sort of replace some of this rhetoric around carbon?
I don't think carbon will be replaced. I don't think so. Maybe the percentage will be small, but I don't think it will be replaced. I don't think we can get rid of 100% of fossil fuel, for example. I don't think so. I think there is still some need for fossil fuel. How much? That's the one that we need to figure out. ESG, not 100% can be justified with the ESG budget. Not everything can be justified by that because companies' money probably just do not have enough budget for that. So, in terms of budgeting, funding, private-public the mix of private-public will always be required all the time. You cannot just focus on ESG funding from companies or whatever, Just like the complexity of biodiversity, it cannot be done in silos. It's got to be look at landscape level. It is how you can find solutions.
That's wonderful. I love all this. I love talking to you about all these things. I've got to see if I've got any more questions I haven't asked you yet. Is there anything you wanted to add that I haven't actually asked you yet in the things that you want to talk about?
I really would like to see Australia to be leader in climate change.
Wouldn't that be amazing? We've got such potential here. It's really always about our politicians being terrible. Are you doing much in that area in the Australian political space? Like, have you made inroads there? Because you've been working with the UN, haven't you? I'm not exactly sure where those areas that you're in at the moment.
Australia, just a little bit. I mean, also during my corporate world, also influenced Australia a little bit on the climate change issues from the corporate side. Lately, maybe from the political side, helping a little bit of senators, Green senators, about the international perspective. For example, the current EU regulation on deforestation, where Australia officially kind of against it. And it's like, don't be against the current. You know, like, don't be against the current. You have to swim with it, but swim it in a more prepared way. So that's what I've been trying to do. And Australia can do so much. Australia is so large. You know, like, there's so many things that we can do here in terms of biodiversity, in terms of carbon market, and so many things. And I think we are a little bit stagnant here with just carbon credit thinking, and also offset, and also net zero. And everything is, like you said, like, everything is being done in silos instead of one. There's a lack of a communication between the NGOs, NGO community with the government, for example. There's a disconnect there.
Are you bridging that? Is that an area that you're working on, bridging between those two?
Not at this stage. Not in Australia. I would love to.
And you see a way to do that? I mean, because you do think outside the box, have you seen a way to handle any of those disconnects? Because I just look at it as in the too hard basket. And whenever I talk to people, they just go, Australians are too parochial, they think too small. The senators are too, like, they're all stuck in their little boxes and they don't want to change. I mean, I have no idea because I'm not in that political world. But what do you see? Do you see more hope for being able to find a way to communicate to them? Or is it through more young people getting into politics? Or what do you see as some of the ways that could be addressed, or that you might address in Australia?
If we can just give a really good example that show people that it works, that's a possibility. Involving younger generation, I have a huge expectation with the young generation in Australia. My own kids, as an example, how they are really more committed to sustainability and everything else than, people from the previous generation. So I have huge hope with the younger generation. But Australia need to show an example where it works. Like, where is it now that you can use an example that we can show in COP, UNFCCC COP, for example? There's none.
Water is evaporating into the atmosphere, and so there's too much atmospheric cloud causing this heat change. I mean, there's lots of science around it, but the reality is we need plants in any form or shape, and CO2 will make plants grow more, but it means that they grow faster without the protein, and people do tend to sort of get a bit caught up in one little bit of science rather than looking at the holistic thing of the whole things. A lot of the stuff that you do is a bit like the whole landscape of the human mind and the different economic parameters from, the smallest Indigenous to the largest corporate. And, in Australia, we have a similar paradigm, let's say, with the white man and the Aboriginal, or the, totally different realities. And how do you bridge and communicate that? So, I mean, we've made some inroads, but really understanding and integrating that knowledge and valuing it, it's hard. It's just really hard to get people to see that things have a financial value, that anything really can be valued financially. But you have to get that understanding of it. So that education piece, I think, is really critical in getting that across the line. And that's why I loved reading all your story about what you'd managed to do in the timber mills, in the pulp factories of Indonesia, particularly with the peat, and that sort of story about the water not getting into the peat by destroying the land around it. All those things are I think obvious to you when you're in it. It's really interesting to come and talk to somebody like yourself who's gone into a totally different world and made a way. So one of the last things I wanted to sort of really bring back, which was really to do with the concept of integration, is this: how did you get to a point where you could continue on? How do you look into yourself and find the inner strength when you are being constantly battled back by negative headspace? How do you get the strength within yourself to keep going?
I think it goes back to what I said before. I break it into piecemeal. So it's very easy to be disheartened and give up in working in our space, sustainability space. If you do these two things, you will be easily brokenhearted. The first one, if you work without a clear scope and boundaries, you have to work on a clear scope and boundaries and create an example of it and have it embedded. For example, I always make sure that everything I do is embedded within a large organization or government or large corporations. That means it stays. It doesn't disappear just because I go away. So it stays. So
that's really good.
When you die, it stays there and other people will continue building it and hopefully not destroying it, but building.
In other words, not making it reliant on you.
Yeah.
Make yourself redundant.
Make sure what you do is embedded into something big and strong. That's number one. And then make sure that whatever you do have a clear scope of boundaries so you can measure it. If you don't have the clear scope and boundaries, you can't measure whether you succeed or fail or whatever or not. And secondly, break it into piecemeals. Break it into small milestones, whatever target that you want to achieve. So yeah, those are keys to make sure that you are not very disheartened or disappointed with whatever.
It's wonderful, Ada. I love that. So when you look at something, let's say the Great Green Wall across Africa, and you see, I'm sure you've had a look at it, and I know I've looked into it and gone, well, that's interesting. Obviously, some big geezer comes up with an idea, lots of money, throws money at it, doesn't have a look at the on the ground reality of getting something to go from one side of the continent to the other with the militia and people, the corruption on the ground and the this, that, the other. When you look at it from your knowledge and what it's like on the ground in any different scenario, different environment, cultural or otherwise, how do you feel it's actually going? Do you feel they've made pretty good progress for the level of difficulty that it actually is to do what they're trying to do there?
Well, I'm not really familiar with that program, actually, Sam. I do pay attention a lot in what's going on in Congo, for example, but not really the Great Green Wall of Africa.
Well, what could you say about what you've seen in the Congo that you think is good that's happened, that you've seen make some achievements?
That attracts the world's attention. That is really good, because if you don't know, you don't help. So first, create the awareness. So now everybody, well, not everybody, but people who pay attention to forest and emission and everything else, everybody in the world knows what Congo Basin is. What is the importance of saving forests in Congo? More people are aware of it. So it's been successful, I think, for the last couple of years in making sure that people are aware what is in there. So once people know what is in there, then okay, how to save it now. And I've known someone quite personally about someone who actually operating in Congo. And right now is amazing that even companies are trying to step up. Companies in the region trying to step up. Okay, what can I do? Maybe not 100%, they still receive a lot of criticism, but at least they want to step up and play a role in saving the forest in Congo, for example. So that's something. I mean, it's not yet, we can't really protect it because there's a lot of licenses being issued, mining and everything else, the government, corruption. Yes, it's very easy to focus on negativity, but if we focus a little bit on the positivity and then push the positivity, then we will get somewhere.
So who would you like to call out to as a company that's done something positive in this area in the Congo?
Well, I can't say that.
You can't say that? Can't even say something good?
Not without their consent. I don't.
Oh, fair enough. That's totally fine. I just thought you might like to say something. Because I know that for me, the Congo comes to mind because of all the EV controversy about the rare metals and what's been being done in terms of human atrocity in the area there. So I'm interested to hear someone in a completely different sector of the Congo talking about something positive happening by just making people aware of it. So that's interesting in itself.
EV is different issues. EV is a mix between human rights and environmental destruction and our efforts to trying to reduce emission. So rare earth mining is a huge threat now in Indonesia, for example, for environmental pollution, deforestation, and human rights violation. You asked me before, I need to say this before I forgot. What can you and I, the consumers, John Doe's on the street, can do to help stop this environmental destruction to continue is to know what you buy. I really emphasizes, please know what you buy. Please know where your handphone is coming from, or what your Nutella is coming from, your everything, like know where your products is coming from and trying to influence from it. I think that's important. For example, if you're an IT tech guy, have a look at what is it in there. Like if you're an EV guy, if you drive around EV vehicles every day, find out where the material is coming from. Is it about nickel? Is it about other things? If it's nickel, like what's going on with nickel, and try to advocate for responsible nickel. It's not about the EV. EV is good, but where the material is coming from, that's the question. Make sure that all the rare earth and everything else being mined are being mined responsibly. I think there's a big gap in EV world there, because
where do you think people can go from to easily source the reality of what's going on with any one product from? I mean, there's lots of avenues for what you're saying. And if I say I pick up a can of a bottle of hand lotion and it says made in Australia, and it may be made one bit of it in Australia, maybe the bottle was made in Australia, but how do you actually source where all the ingredients are from, or that it's, and then let's just say you do source it and there's some aspect of it that's really bad, maybe you're able to go down that rabbit hole. When you say advocate for it, are you going to just not buy the whole product because of it, or are you asking them to ring the manufacturer and say, I don't like that you're sourcing this ingredient from this place because it does X, Y, Z, and educate the manufacturer? Maybe they don't know, or what are you asking people to do with that?
Well, first figure out what platform you want to be focusing on.
Good. I like these little vignettes. Well, that's wonderful. I think I've pretty much gone through all my questions, and I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's wonderful. It's filled with lots of really good vibe ideas and things that people can do. So on that note, is there anything else you'd like to add, or that you feel like you'd like to just tell people about forests and why your love of forests is something that keeps you motivated and inspired? Some small story? Wonderful. That's a lovely note to finish off on. Thank you so much, Aida. I really enjoyed the conversation. Bye. Bye.